What is good, everyone? Welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be telling you about Xanax alternatives that actually work. Just a disclaimer that I am not a licensed doctor and this is not medical advice. This video is for educational purposes only. Make sure to get a licensed doctor approval and supervision before trying any of these compounds. So before we get into the alternatives, it's important to understand how Xanax actually works. Xanax is in the benzodiazepine drug class, along with other compounds such as Klonopin, Ativan, Valium. All benzodiazepines pretty much work in the same way, which is being a positive allosteric modulator of the GABA-A receptor. All that really means is that it makes your GABA receptor more sensitive to GABA in the system, and GABA is your body's natural braking system. It slows down metabolism, makes you tired and sleepy, reduces anxiety, and that's the effect that benzos have. Benzos are commonly prescribed for anxiety, but they are actually very, very dangerous compounds. I'd say besides the psychologically addictive aspect, the most dangerous risk is the physical dependence that you build. Benzos and alcohol have the only withdrawal out of all the drugs that can actually kill you. So if you built a physical dependence to a benzo and then you suddenly stop, you're literally at risk of death. And if you do survive, now you have a risk at having a protracted withdrawal, which basically means that the withdrawal is so toxic to your brain that you literally get permanent brain damage for the rest of your life. The alternatives in this video are meant to be as effective as possible without the huge risk of benzos. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So number one of the alternatives, we have etifoxine, often sold under the brand name Stressam. In many studies, etifoxine has been shown to be as effective at reducing anxiety as benzos. But the crazy part is that it doesn't come with any of the side effects. And it actually works really similarly to benzos. It still acts as a positive allosteric modulator of the GABA receptor, but in a different way that doesn't cause it to have any tolerance. And it also doesn't cause it to have many side effects that benzos have, like sleepiness, memory impairment, cognitive impairment, but is as effective at reducing anxiety. It also boosts your body's production of certain neurosteroids like allopregnanolone, which you can kind of think of as your body's naturally producing benzo. So etifoxine is probably at the top of the list just because of its effectiveness and its risk profile. It looks great. The next compound on this list is buspirone. This medication is very commonly used to treat anxiety, and it works by binding to certain serotonin receptors which reduce stress and fear. And apparently it's non-addictive and doesn't have any dependence. But it takes a couple weeks to start working after you start taking it. I haven't looked too deep into this one, but it looks pretty effective, so maybe check it out. Next up, we got pregabalin. Pregabalin is just a slightly modified version of gabapentin, which made it way more bioavailable and way more potent per milligram than gabapentin. Pregabalin and also gabapentin are in the gabapentinoid drug class. Some physicians prescribe pregabalin off-label for generalized anxiety disorder, but it's definitely not the first-line treatment. But I noticed that it is pretty effective at reducing anxiety. This is also one of those slightly stronger compounds. It does feel a little more intoxicating. In some ways, it's kind of similar to benzos, but there's not as much memory loss and other effects. It does feel differently, but it does feel kind of similar. But pregabalin does not bind to any GABA receptors. It binds to voltage-gated calcium channels, which makes tolerance for pregabalin build much slower than it does for benzos. But the catch with pregabalin is that there is still tolerance and there can be withdrawal, pretty severe as well. Not as severe as, death, but in very extreme cases, you can have seizures, rebound anxiety, insomnia, all that stuff. The tolerance just builds a lot slower than it does with benzos. Next up, we have beta blockers such as propranolol. What propranolol does is act as an antagonist in adrenaline receptors, which basically means that it blocks adrenaline from binding to the adrenergic receptors, which pretty much decreases the activity of adrenaline in your system, which ends up being pretty effective at reducing the physical symptoms of anxiety. So, if you have really bad anxiety and, your heart is pounding and you're sweating and you have all these physical symptoms, propranolol and beta blockers can fully stop the physical symptoms. But it does not directly treat anxious thoughts. that's completely different. Beta blockers can also build tolerance, and you can have rebound adrenaline after you come off them. So this is definitely, as well as all these other compounds, you want to do under the supervision of a doctor. But yeah, that's beta blockers. It's actually most commonly prescribed to treat high blood pressure because it does a really good job at lowering blood pressure. Next up, we got zuranolone. Zuranolone is most commonly prescribed for postpartum depression, and I can quickly explain why for a sec. When a woman is pregnant, her natural levels of progesterone are through the roof. Through various enzymes, progesterone gets converted into allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone is basically your body's like built-in benzo. It also works as a positive allosteric modulator of the GABA A receptor, exactly like benzos. And levels of allopregnanolone in pregnant women can be as high as 20 times more than someone who isn't pregnant. But when the baby is born, the levels of allopregnanolone drop back to baseline. And the theory is that while the woman was pregnant, she built a tolerance to allopregnanolone, and suddenly having that drop is kind of like withdrawing off of it cold turkey, which can be very dysphoric and lead to a sort of depression. So this is where zuranolone comes in. Zuranolone is an allopregnanolone analog, which basically means they took allopregnanolone, did a little bit of chemistry, like changed a few small things, but it's pretty much the same, and then use it to bind to the same receptors in the body. So it still does the exact same thing as allopregnanolone, just works a little bit differently. And the reason why an analog was made instead of just, synthesized allopregnanolone being used in the body is because allopregnanolone isn't actually that bioavailable and doesn't bind that well when you take it exogenously. So yeah, little lesson there, but that's zuranolone. It takes 2 to 3 days for the effects to kick in. It's a little bit, softer than benzos, but pretty similar. It has basically the exact same mechanism of action. But this is something to be careful with because it can still cause all the same side effects as benzos and also can cause tolerance and withdrawal. So it's something to be careful of. Usually it's only used for a 14-day kind of treatment. I added this in the list more as like a, educational, informational kind of option. Not as much like an actual consideration. Unless you're going through postpartum depression, then maybe, yeah. But if not, I don't know how actually practical it would be since it does carry a lot of the same like risk and side effects. Next up, we got bromantane. So bromantane is an interesting compound. It was developed in the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s for basically soldiers. It was meant to reduce fatigue, increase focus, and also increase heat resistance, cold resistance, all that stuff. So it was actually made as like kind of a nootropic and something for soldiers. But after trying it, I noticed that for me, it has very noticeable anxiolytic properties. In many new social situations where I usually would have like some nervousness, it was completely gone. I was way more confident. I wouldn't say way more talkative because if you do take too much, it does kind of make you feel a bit like a robot, because what it does is basically boost dopamine synthesis and it makes your thoughts and emotions, a little more smooth. But if your dosages are too high, then it's just going to be too flat. You're going to feel like a robot with no emotions. But don't worry, I don't want to scare you, because the thing about bromantane that I love is that it doesn't cause any tolerance and it can be taken indefinitely, which means you can literally take it for like a year straight and then stop and nothing's gonna change. But I still do recommend cycling because, cycling, anything is just always a safe practice. And this is a very like off-label thing because bromantane, I haven't heard it anywhere being used for anxiety. People are aware that it has anxiolytic properties, but it was never used for that. But for me, it was a pretty cool tool. Moving on to the next one, we have ambien. Ambien is in the class of Z drugs, which are pretty interesting compounds. Ambien is prescribed for short-term treatment of insomnia, and it is very effective for sleep. So if you were using for benzos, not really for anxiety, but for falling asleep, this is one of your alternatives. It does bind to the GABA A receptor, just like benzodiazepines, but to a different subunit. And the GABA A receptor has 5 different subunits, which are responsible for different effects like, muscle relaxant, drowsiness, anxiolysis. And ambien is selective for the subunits that just make you drowsy and tired. And it does have some pretty funny effects, or, side effects, like sleepwalking, preparing and eating food while you're not fully awake. It's a pretty interesting one, still on my bucket list, but it does have a high potential for habit formation, aka you can get addicted to it. And it also does have physical dependence. So, this isn't the most risk-free option, but if you're using benzos for sleep, this is definitely a safer alternative that I would consider. And the last compound on this list, we have hydroxyzine. Hydroxyzine works completely differently than basically all of the compounds on this list by being an antihistamine, which, if you didn't know, is usually used to treat allergies. But interestingly, it has anxiolytic properties. I can't personally vouch for this since I haven't tried it myself, but it is prescribed for anxiety, and I do kind of believe it because I am prescribed cetirizine for my allergies. And even though cetirizine doesn't really cross the blood-brain barrier as much as hydroxyzine, I still feel a kind of calming, sedating, anxiolytic effect. But I guess hydroxyzine is especially good at that. And this one is actually commonly used as a non-addictive benzodiazepine alternative, which I think is totally sick. Like, when it comes to like antihistamines, things like that, you do not have to worry about getting addicted to them. But the fact that it has that anxiolytic and calming and sedating effects is pretty sick. So that's the last alternative on this list. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. Remember, do not take any of the compounds talked about in this video without first talking to your doctor first, getting their thoughts and their approval and their supervision. If you don't know what you're doing, you're putting yourself at a big risk. So always consult with your doctor first. But yeah, leave a comment down below and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.